My guest at this time is Dr. Bonner Cohen. He's a senior fellow at the National Center for Public Policy Research. He joins me now as the Trump administration zeroes in on repealing the Waters of the United States rule, also known as WOTUS. The repeal announcement has already happened. It will actually go into effect 60 days after it's published in the Federal Register. For the next few minutes, we'll discuss what this rule was, why it matters that it's going away, and what comes next. And Dr. Cohen, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, this action from the Trump administration repeals a regulatory rule put in place during the Obama years. So let's go back a little bit. What was the old policy, and what did the Obama administration change it to?
The old policy arose from a series of court decisions along with the original Clean Water Act, which was enacted in 1972. What this really has to do with is what the federal government, specifically the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, what they can regulate and what they cannot regulate. And the phrase that's used in the Clean Water Act referring to the jurisdiction of the federal government is Waters of the United States, abbreviated as WOTUS, W-O-T-U-S. But there was always a question of what that really applied to. Now, we can think certainly this would be bays, estuaries, rivers, what have you. But what about creeks? What about stock ponds? What about wetlands, including wetlands that are not wet all throughout the year, but just seasonally? Under the guise of bringing clarification to this question, a question which had been made even more complicated by some very ambivalent Supreme Court decisions, two of them in the early 2000s, the Obama administration decided, well, WOTUS applied to all of the above. In other words, every possible body of water you could imagine, including drainage ditches, including stock ponds on Farmer Brown's farm. And what this really was a scheme for federal zoning, that if you, as a landowner, and you could be a farmer, a rancher, a fruit grower, or just someone who has some property in a rural area, if you wanted to do something on your property, under the Obama 2015 rule, you would have had to get a permit from EPA to do whatever it is that you wanted to do on your property. Now, there are many things you don't want to do in life, and getting a permit from EPA is one of them. It takes a month of Sundays. It can cost thousands of dollars. And the person, the bureaucrat at EPA, who is making the decision as to whether you could do something on your property or not, would be someone who had never set foot on your property, never seen your property. And if you didn't like the decision that this person came up with, what could you do about it? Answer, absolutely nothing.
Talk a little more about what you had to get permission for. Did it have to relate to the water that's on your property, or just the fact that you have water on your property meant that if you wanted to repaint the barn that you had to get EPA approval?
Therein lies the problem. This was never completely clear. But the Obama administration essentially wrote blank checks to EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers so that they could slap jurisdictional claims on your property almost at will. So if you had a property and you wanted to put in a drainage ditch, in other words, you would create something, or you had a drainage ditch and there was nothing else to drain in that ditch and you wanted to just simply cover it up, you were going to have to go to EPA to get a permit. It was, as I said, it was a blank check handed to a federal regulatory agency, which quite frankly already has enough power at its disposal. And it was a sword of Damocles that hung over rural America because whether it was a farmer or a rancher or a home builder, you never knew what you could or could not do on your own property. And the only way you could find that out was to go to bureaucrats who have a vested interest in expanding the regulatory writ of that agency. So this was an absolute monstrosity. Trump had pledged to do away with it, and he has done just that. And he did so in a two-step process. First of all, he repealed the Obama federal zoning, which is really what this was. He repealed the Obama federal zoning WOTUS rule in toto, and in a second step, he will announce, or the administration will finally come up with a real definition of what is a waters of the United States, though identifying the kinds of bodies of water over which the federal government has regulation, because that list is actually nowhere.
You mentioned that this acted as the sword of Damocles over property owners. How often did the sword get swung? In other words, did it basically paralyze folks because they feared the government would make their life miserable, or did the government actually make their lives miserable?
The government would gladly have made their lives miserable, but never had the chance, because after the Obama rule was implemented, people around the country, from trade associations, farmers, attorneys general, and what have you, they took the Obama administration to court, and they did so very successfully. Just in the last 3 months, before the Trump administration rolled back the Obama rule, 2 court decisions, one in Texas and one in Georgia, and these were federal court decisions, told the EPA to take the rule back. In other words, they essentially said that the Obama administration had gone far beyond what the Clean Water Act allowed it to do, that it had acted in an unconstitutional fashion, and that that EPA was going to have to rewrite the rule, which, as it turns out, under Trump, it was doing anyway. So fortunately, landowners never really bore the brunt of this, but they did so solely because they sued. But they were, in fact, paralyzed, many of them anyway, for 3 or 4 years, not knowing how the court decisions would turn out. So now this tremendous burden has been lifted from their shoulders, and now they have a certain degree of regulatory certainty.
So that's the legal impact of this already. What's the likely economic impact?
That will be huge, because no longer will people have to worry about making modifications on their property which they bought and on which they pay taxes. They're no longer going to have to worry about that as long as they don't break the law in the process. If they need a permit for something from the county, fine, go to the county and get a permit. But you don't have to go to Washington to get the permit. So this is going to give farmers, ranchers, fruit growers, loggers, and what have you, a certain peace of mind that they did not have as long as they were looking at the Obama WOTUS rule, and I think is going to further unleash the creative entrepreneurial impulses in rural America, and I think the country as a whole will benefit immensely from this. And it's a real blow to the administrative regulatory state, because every time a federal agency, be it EPA or what have you, writes a new rule or regulation, that rule or regulation has the force of law behind it. So what we really have here, and we've had it for decades, we have agencies essentially becoming law-making bodies. This stuff is supposed to be done by Congress and not by regulatory agencies. And what the Trump administration has done here is it has rolled back the biggest power grab in EPA's history.
Dr. Cohen, you mentioned there's regulatory certainty now, at least as long as folks who agree with this administration are in the administration or at the EPA. So if there's a new president in 2021 or 2025 or whenever, someone with a different idea of what this policy ought to be can come in, will it be as easy for them to put the WOTUS rule back into place as it was for the Obama administration, or will it be more difficult?
It will now be more difficult because there are court decisions, and these are, in some cases, Supreme Court decisions and federal court decisions that clearly reined in the Obama rule. So if we have an administration in the future that wants to once again strengthen the regulatory state, it wants to use the WOTUS rule, it will have to create its own rule, and it can't really replicate the monstrosity that the Obama people came up with, because huge chunks of that have been struck down by court rulings.
Fascinating. We've covered this a lot, and it's very interesting to see what's happening now. Dr. Cohen, thank you very much for your time today.
Well, thank you very much.
You bet. Dr. Bonner Cohen, Senior Fellow at the National Center for Public Policy Research. I'm Greg Columbus reporting for Radio America.